She will cry and beg me back, the Duke of Renfield said, and he said it with a laugh, in his own front hall at 11 o'clock on a black November night, while the footman carried his trunks past the portraits of his ancestors and out to a carriage with another woman's furs already warming inside it. "Give it till Candlemas, Sylvia," he said, drawing on his gloves the way some men draw a sword. 6 weeks of an empty house and a cold pew and the county's eyes on her, and there will be a letter in Vienna wet through with weeping, begging me to come home on any terms I please, and I shall read it to you over chocolate. And we shall decide together, you and I, how long to let her wait for the answer. And Mrs. Sylvia Fairfax, beautiful in sable, laughed her low laugh and took his arm. And the great door of Renfield Hall shut behind the pair of them with a boom like a funeral bell. He was wrong about almost everything a man can be wrong about, and it took exactly 140 days to prove it, but he was wrong about one thing before the carriage even reached the gates. Because he had believed his wife asleep, and Marianne, Duchess of Renfield, was standing on the dark half landing of the great stair in her dressing gown, where she had come down with a candle to see whether the noise was really what she thought it was, and she heard every word. She did not gasp. She did not weep. She did not call out into the frozen dark after the wheels. She stood on the landing until the sound of the carriage had thinned into wind, and then she blew out her candle, because she found she could think better without watching her own hand shake, and she stood a while longer in the whole dark of the sleeping-house, and what she felt, to her own astonishment, arriving slowly through the pane like a lamp carried up a long avenue, was something she had not felt in 5 years. She felt the future open. If you have ever stood in the dark and heard exactly what someone believes you are, in words they never intended you to hear, and felt the strange, cold freedom of it, because a person who knows the worst is finally free to act, then this story is yours. So before the spring comes, and oh, it is coming, take a moment to subscribe. Tell me in the comments what city you are watching from, and give the story a like if you have ever been worth more than your price. Because the Duke of Renfield is going to get a letter by spring, that much of his prophecy will hold, but it will not be wet with weeping, and when he comes racing home across half of Europe to answer it in person, he is going to stand in an Easter crowd and watch the morning light strike fire out of a ring on his wife's hand that he never gave her. And to understand how a woman gets from a dark stair in November to that particular sunrise, we must go back to the beginning, which was, as these beginnings so often are, a bargain struck over her head. Marianne Hale was the only child of a quiet scholar gentleman of good blood and thin purse, and of a mother whose own mother, a formidable Bristol widow, had left Marianne the whole of a shipping fortune tied up in a settlement so shrewdly drawn that 3 firms of London lawyers had winced over it in turn, money settled to her separate use, hedged and walled and moated, with trustees empowered in terms that read less like a legal instrument than like a grandmother's cold blue eye fixed on posterity. Renfield needed that fortune the way a drowning man needs a spar. The dukedom was old, the roofs were older, and Edmund, the young duke, was charming, indebted, and for sale, though the bill of sale was printed in the polite language of an alliance. Marianne was 22, and nobody asked her what she wanted. They asked her what she thought of the west front of Renfield Hall in the autumn light, which is a different question. And she was dutiful, and her father was dazzled, and the settlement was signed, and the grandmother's moat of clauses went with her to her marriage like a dowry of dry powder, waiting. as it turned out. 14 years for a spark. For 5 of those years, Marianne was a duchess, the way a caged linnet is a musician, technically, and on request. Edmund was not cruel in any way the county could name. He was worse. He was indifferent, with that seamless, well-mannered indifference that leaves no bruise for a friend to point at, and no scene to cite, only a slow starvation conducted at the breakfast table. He answered her remarks without hearing them. He accepted her management of the household without once noticing it was brilliant. He spent her income graciously and her company grudgingly, and the childlessness of the marriage, which was a private grief to her, he treated as a species of household shortfall, referred to obliquely, laid, like all shortfalls, at the steward's door or hers. She did what unloved, capable women have always done. She poured the love somewhere it would take. She built the parish school with her pin money and taught in it 2 mornings a week over the vicar's scandalized objections, and then over his converted blessing. She knew every cottager on the estate by name and ailment. She kept the gardens of Renfield with her own designs until they were spoken of 3 counties off, and if her husband never once walked them with her, the bees did, and the village children did, and a quiet neighbouring gentleman named Mr. Henry Ashe did, once a year, on the open day, with his hat in his hand, though it would be 4 more years before either of them thought anything of it, and honesty compels the record to state that when the thinking finally started, it started on her side too. Mrs. Sylvia Fairfax came into the county with the August race meeting, a baronet's widow of celebrated looks and unexamined income, and she surveyed the neighbourhood the way a general surveys ground, and chose Renfield, and it must be said for her professional judgment that she chose well. For she had identified at a single dinner the 2 facts that mattered, that the Duke was starving for admiration, and that the Duchess was too proud to compete for what she was owed. The campaign that followed was conducted in plain sight, which was its genius. Sylvia was everywhere correct. She flattered the Duchess to her face with a warmth 1 degree too bright, took her arm at assemblies, called her dearest creature, and made of her very courtesy a display of who was hostess in that friendship, while the Duke rode with her, and drove with her, and read poetry aloud to her, who had never in 5 years read so much as a newspaper paragraph aloud to his wife, and the county watched it all with the appetite counties have, and waited for the Duchess to weep or rage or fight, and were disappointed. Marianne fought no battle she could not win. She would not compete for her own husband like a tradesman undercutting a rival. That road had no dignity at the end of it, whichever way it went. So she went on steadily, school and garden and household, with her head up, and only 2 people ever knew what it cost her. Mrs. Keel, the housekeeper, who found her once standing quite still in the linen room, with her hands pressed flat on the cold shelf, not crying, just standing, and said nothing then and everything later, and old Lady Havermery, the Duke's godmother, a dowager marchioness with a tongue like a stropped razor, who called at Renfield in October, took 1 long look across the tea-table at where the Duke sat leaning toward Mrs. Fairfax's murmuring, and said on the doorstep departing, "To Marian alone, my dear, I stood godmother to that boy, and I tell you the font took better than the boy did. He is his father over again, all frontage, and I will say now what nobody said to his mother, when the crash comes, and it is coming, do not go down with him out of good manners, come to me." Then November, and Vienna. It was Sylvia's scheme, A winter among the embassies where a duke's arm is worth double and a wife is a document one need not travel with, and Edmund agreed the way he agreed to everything she proposed, with the sensation which she manufactured for him nightly that he had thought of it himself. What neither of them manufactured was a story for the Duchess, because it did not occur to either that a story was owed. He informed his wife at Tuesday breakfast, between the post and the marmalade, that he would winter abroad for his health, the household to remain, and Marianne looked at him for a moment across 14 years of her grandmother's money holding up his roof, and said only, "Your health has my prayers, Edmund." And he said, "Thank you, my dear," and read his letter, and that was the whole of the leave taking between the Duke and Duchess of Renfield, that and a laugh in a midnight hall he believed empty, 6 weeks of an empty house and a cold pew. And there will be a letter in Vienna wet through with weeping. You know now what he did not, that she stood above him in the dark and received the entire testament of what she was to him, a certainty, a cupboard thing, a spaniel that begs, and you know what she felt when the door boomed shut, the lamp coming up the long avenue, the future opening. Here is what she did with it. She went back up the stairs in the dark, and she slept. Actually slept. For the first time in months, the way soldiers are said to sleep on the eve of a battle finally fixed after a long false peace. And in the morning she did not write to Vienna. She did not write to her father. She did not summon the vicar, or weep to Mrs. Keeley, or take to her room. She rang for her writing desk at 8, and at 9 she was closeted with the steward over the estate books. And at 11 she wrote one letter, 3 lines, to London, to the senior surviving trustee of her grandmother's settlement, a dry, deliberate, terribly punctual old lawyer by the name of Mr. Elias Qualls. And the 3 lines said, "Dear Mr. Qualls, I believe the contingency my grandmother provided against has arrived. I should be glad of your earliest convenience. The house is quiet, and I am quite well." It was the phrase my grandmother provided against that put speed into an old man's boots, because Elias Qualls had been junior counsel 40 years before, when the Bristol widow sat dictating her clauses, and he had heard her say of the charming young men of great houses, "Mark me, Qualls, one of them will get at my girl's girl one day. And when he shows himself, I want her armed cap a pie from beyond the grave." And he had drawn the armour himself, clause by clause, and had waited his whole career, with the patience of his profession, to see whether it would ever be buckled on. He arrived before the week was out, shook the snow off his hat, took soup, and then sat with the Duchess in the library until long past midnight, going through the settlement line by candlelight, and at the end of it he set down his pen, looked at the composed young woman across the table, and delivered himself of the longest speech anyone living had heard from him. "Your Grace, your husband has deserted you, that is grief, but in law it is also a door. For by the terms I drew, his lifetime interest in your fortune was conditioned expressly upon cohabitation and conduct. Your grandmother insisted upon the words, and I remember the morning she chose them, and a man who has removed himself abroad with another woman has, in my opinion, and I am prepared to defend it to the House of Lords, forfeited the condition. From Lady Day next, the income is yours alone. But that, your Grace, is only the pistol. What I must now tell you concerns the powder magazine, because in preparing for this interview I had occasion to examine the muniments your grandmother's caution required to be deposited with the trust, and among them, your Grace, is a paper which I believe the Duke does not know we hold, and which changes, if I may borrow a term from artillery, the entire range of the engagement. The paper was a contract of marriage, and the name upon it, beside the Duke of Renfield's unmistakable slanting hand, was not Marianne Hale's. 14 years earlier it emerged, in the year before his English wedding, the young Duke, then abroad outrunning his first crop of debts, had engaged himself in Vienna, formally in writing, before witnesses, to a wealthy widowed countess of that city, a Countess von Arnholt, and had received from her, upon the strength of the engagement, sums approaching £8,000, and had then, when the English match with its far greater fortune ripened, simply come home and married it, leaving the contract unbroken, the money unreturned, and the Countess to her mortification, trusting to distance and to the lady's pride to bury the affair. And distance and pride had obliged him for 14 years. How the paper came to the trust was the grandmother's doing from beyond the grave, as everything in this story finally is. Her Bristol house had corresponded with half the shipping money in Europe. Her agents had made quiet inquiries into the charming young Duke as a matter of course. Mark me, Qualls, one of them will get at my girl's girl. And what her agents found they bought, paying the Countess's man of business handsomely for a certified copy against the day it might be wanted. And it had lain in the deed box under 40 years of dust, a shot loaded by a dead woman, waiting for a target her granddaughter's dignity would one day consent to name. I must be plain with you as to what this paper is and is not, said Qualls. It is probably not, after such lapse of years, a bar that voids your marriage of itself. These questions are deep water, and I will not pretend the channel is marked. But it is proof of fraud, your grace, fraud upon you, fraud upon your father, fraud upon the settlement itself. For he came to the treaty of your marriage bound and encumbered and concealed it, and with it, and with the desertion, and with what the Countess's lawyers will do the moment they learn the English trust can prove the debt, I can promise you this. He will not fight. He will settle on any terms we name a full deed of separation, your fortune released absolutely, your freedom effectively entire. Because the alternative we can offer him is the public reading of that contract in a courtroom, and a man who lives as that man lives upon appearances will sign anything at all to keep that particular document folded. Name your terms, your grace, and I will draw them, and we shall see whether the gentleman still expects a letter wet with weeping. Marianne sat for a time with her hands folded, looking not at the lawyer, but at the candle flame, and when she spoke it was very quietly. He told her I would cry and beg, she said. Those were his words, Mr. Qualls. I stood on the stair and heard them. She will cry and beg me back, give it till Candlemas. Then she looked up, and the lawyer, who told the story only once, years after, to his successor as a professional education, said that in 50 years of practice he had never seen a face so entirely without vengeance and so entirely without mercy at the same moment. Draw the terms, she said. Everything honest, everything provable, nothing cruel. We are not brigands. But Mr. Qualls, mark the calendar as my grandmother would have marked it. He said Candlemas, so we shall be punctual. Let his own lawyers receive our papers at Candlemas, to the day. And so it was done. And while it was doing, the strangest winter of Marianne's life unfolded over Renfield like weather from another latitude, because the house that was supposed to break her turned out, emptied of its master, to fit her exactly. 6 weeks of an empty house and a cold pew that had been the sentence, and the empty house filled at once, with the school children practicing their carols in the great hall because the schoolroom chimneys smoked, with Lady Havemiry's carriage weekly, with the tenants' Christmas dinner held under the ancestors' portraits for the first time since the old Duke died, and the cold pew that county noticed, and counties notice everything, held a Duchess straight-backed and clear-voiced every single Sunday, better attended by her neighbours' respect week upon week, while the whispers of Vienna, and there are always travellers, and travellers always right, ran round the drawing-rooms and slowly, decisively changed sides. His letters began in January, as the money began to pinch. The first was airy, my dear Marianne. The season here, the embassies, trusting she kept well. A postscript about a bill of exchange the hall should honour. She filed it, unanswered, in a drawer, and instructed the steward that bills of exchange drawn abroad were no longer the estate's affair, Mr. Quarles having so advised, which he had with relish. The second letter was less airy. The third mentioned, in the tone of a man granting an indulgence, that if she found her situation lonely, he was not unwilling to discuss her joining him at Easter, provided certain economies. The fourth, arriving hard behind the Candamer's papers like a yelp behind a slammed door, was not airy at all. It was incredulous. It was wounded. It demanded to know what she meant by it, whether she had run mad, whether she understood what she risked, whether she imagined for one moment that a woman of her plainness and her years, the pen had actually written it, would find the world kind outside the shelter of his name. She read that one twice, standing by the library window in the winter light, and Mrs. Keeley, who was laying the fire, watched her out of the corner of a loyal eye, and reported afterward to the kitchen with awe that her Grace had smiled at the letter, smiled the way you smile at a child's drawing of a dragon, and had said, half to herself, the shelter of his name, and then folded the letter into the drawer with the others and rung for the school accounts. She was not performing composure by then, you understand. Somewhere in that winter, between the carols in the hall and the punctual papers, the performance had quietly become the person. He had prophesied a woman on her knees by Candlemas. Candlemas came and found her upright, solvent, busy, and, by the terms of a deed his own lawyers begged him on their knees to sign, free, now for Mr. Henry Ashe, because the spring is coming, and the ring must be got ready, and it is time you knew the man whose mother wore it first. He held the manor of Ashe Cumb, the next estate but one, a modest place kept in beautiful heart, and he held it the way he held everything, quietly, competently, and without the smallest need to be observed doing it. He was 40, a widower of many years' standing, whose young wife had died within a 12-month of their marriage, and the county had long ago filed him under confirmed and harmless, a sound man on drainage committees, a magistrate the poor were not afraid of, a man who read too much and danced correctly and seldom and went home early. What the county did not know, because he had never seen reason to publish it, was that Henry Ashe was heir presumptive to his uncle, the Baron Ashe of Ravensmoor, a childless invalid in Cumberland, and that he had twice refused his uncle's invitation to come north and live expectantly, as he put it, to his one confidant, like a crow on a wall, watching a sick sheep, preferring his own fields, his own books, and his own name plainly earned. Keep that in your pocket, as he kept it. We shall want it at a wedding. His acquaintance with the Duchess of Renfield was 10 years old and 1 inch deep. The open garden day. The committee for the school roof, a dozen dinners at long tables where they had been seated far apart and had each, though neither confessed it for years, noticed the other listening, really listening, in a room full of people waiting to speak. It was the flood at Candlemas that broke the ice 10 years thick. The beck that fed the Renfield water meadows came down in February full of snowmelt and took out the old sluice. And the flood ran at the home farm and the school lane together, and the steward being laid up and the Duke being in Vienna composing his 4th letter, it was the Duchess in boots on the bank at 7 in the morning directing the sandbagging, and it was Henry Ashe who arrived unsent at past with 30 men from Ashcombe and his own timber. Because water, as he observed to her by way of good morning, is no respecter of park walls, and they fought the beck together for 2 days, and got the better of it, and somewhere in the second afternoon, soaked and mud-streaked, handing along planks in the rain beside a Duchess doing the same, he said something dry that made her laugh, actually laugh, out loud, on a flooded bank in February, and stopped, appalled at himself, and said, "Forgive me, I have not heard that sound before. I would have gone into the water a week ago to hear it," and then turned scarlet to his hat brim, and talked determinedly about sluice gates for a quarter of an hour, and Marianne worked on beside him with the rain on her face and thought, so that is what it feels like, being seen. It is quite ordinary and it is everything, and that night in her own room she was stern with herself in her grandmother's voice about widows and fools, and it did not answer. The sternness, it did not answer at all. What followed was a courtship that would have disappointed a novelist and satisfied a farmer, conducted over parish business and drainage plans and the school accounts through the wet end of winter, without one speech that could have been quoted against either of them, and with a mutual, growing, carefully unspoken astonishment at how much there was to say. He never once spoke ill of the Duke, which she noted. She never once spoke of her marriage at all, which he noted, and Lady Havermery, who missed nothing, watched the two of them bent over a culvert map in her own morning room in March, their heads a foot apart and their voices happy, and remarked to her companion afterward that she had seen many a grand passion begin with less sense and end with less hope, and that she intended, God willing, to dance at the outcome. The deed of separation was executed the 2nd week of March, the Duke's signature arriving from Vienna without contest, exactly as Quarles had promised, for the folded contract had been mentioned, merely mentioned, in a single subordinate clause of the trustee's letter, and the effect had been that of showing a burglar the mastiff, and with the deed came, by the same messenger, a private note from the Duke to his wife, the 5th letter, and the last for a long while, in which incredulity had curdled at last into something almost honest. "I do not understand you," it said. "I offered you the greatest name in 3 counties, and you have traded it for account books and mud," Sylvia said from the first you were a shopkeeper's granddaughter at heart. "And I begin to think her. Right, keep your money then, and much joy of your empty house." She filed it with the others, ribbon tied now, a little archive of a man discovering by post what he had thrown away, and if you think she kept them out of softness, you have not been attending. She kept them as her grandmother kept the Countess's contract. Evidence ages well, and pride writes confessions no torturer could extract. It was Henry who asked, in the end, though she had begun to wonder, with a spinsterish terror she recognized from the inside out, whether his scruples would outlast them both, a separated Duchess being no simple thing to court, whatever the deed said. He came to the school on a Friday in the last week of March, when the children had gone shouting home and she was stacking the slates. And he stood in the doorway, turning his hat in his hands, exactly as he had done at her garden gate years before, and he said, "I have rehearsed a speech, and I find I cannot say rehearsed things to you. You always hear the joints in them. So here is the plain timber. I am a middling man with a middling estate, and I have loved you, I think, for years, before I permitted myself to know it. And I am too old to enjoy pretending otherwise, and too much your friend to go on deceiving you by silence. I know what you are leaving behind you, and I know what I am not. But no one alive will ever be gladder of you than I am, and if you will wear a ring of mine, it was my mother's, it is only garnets. I will spend what years I am given proving that the arithmetic of hearts runs opposite to the arithmetic of rank, and the smallest house may hold the greatest sum." And Marianne set down the slates, and looked at this man turning his hat like a boy in the doorway of a school she had built out of loneliness, and found that after 14 years of composure her voice had gone perfectly useless. And so she gave him her hand instead, which answered better, and when she could speak she said, "The arithmetic was never against you, Henry. I have done the sums. Yours is the only fortune I have ever wanted, and it has taken me half my life to learn that it was the only kind that is real. Before the Easter bells, 3 visits must be paid, for a betrothal in that world was not an event, but a progress, and each of the 3 tells you something the wedding day alone could not. The first was to her father. Mr. Hale was old by then, whiter and smaller in his book-room among the folios, and Marianne had written him faithfully every fortnight of her marriage, cheerful letters, informative letters, letters a scholar could read twice without once meeting his daughter in them. And he had understood the code as parents of composed children always understand it, entirely, and too late. And said nothing, because what was there to say that would not cost her the composure she was living on? When she came to him now, in person, with her news, he heard her out standing at the window with his back to her, and was silent so long that she thought he had not understood, and then he said, without turning, in the voice of a man opening a door he had kept locked a long time, "Marianne, I must say a thing, and you must let me say it to the glass, for I cannot say it to your face. On your wedding morning, your mother's mother took me aside, and she told me I was selling you, those were her words, selling you for a name because I was dazzled, and that she was too old to stop it and too rich to be forgiven for it, and that she would do the only thing left, which was to arm you. And I laughed at her, my dear. I laughed at a woman who saw 14 years down the road I could not see 14 days down. She armed you, and I dazzled, and you have paid for the difference in the coin of your one life. And now you come to me with your face full of light to tell me you are to marry a plain, sensible man who loves you. And you stand in my book-room, asking whether I approve, as if my approval had ever once been worth what it cost you." And he turned round then, and his daughter saw that he was weeping, this dry old man among his folios, and he said, "I approve of Mr. Ash of Ashy Combe. I approved of him the moment I heard what he did at the flood. But I want it said in this room, where I did the harm, that the finest thing in my library walked out of it at 22 because I liked the binding on a bad book, and if your grandmother can hear us, She has earned the last word." And Marianne crossed the room and took her father's hands and gave the last word to the person it belonged to, saying, "She has it already, Papa. It is on my hand." And there is nothing to forgive a man who has just told the truth at his own expense. That is the rarest courage there is. Edmund never found it, and you have. And so the account is closed. They dined together that evening, father and daughter, easier than they had been in 20 years, and the visit matters to this story because of what it teaches. That the wreckage of a bad bargain is never confined to the two who signed it, and neither is the mending. The second visit was Quarles, who came down from London unsummoned at his age in Lent, ostensibly to perfect the marriage settlement, in fact, as everyone at once perceived, to inspect Mr. Henry Ashe, whom he examined across the library table for 2 full hours on subjects ranging from the drainage of upland pasture to the funding of parish schools to, at the last, delivered as dryly as a query about title, the question of what Mr. Ashe he conceived he was gaining by the match. And Henry, who had been answering carefully and well, put down his pen at that and said, plainly, "Mr. Quarles, I decline to answer that question in the language it was asked in, because it is a lawyer's question, and this is not a matter at law. What do I gain, sir? I gain the woman who stood on the bank at the Candlemas flood. If you had seen her there, you would not need the answer, and if you did see her, all those years ago, at a table in Bristol, dictating her clauses, for I think, sir, that you loved that old woman's mind the way I love her granddaughter's whole self, then you have the answer already, and we may go back to the settlement." And there was a silence, and the old lawyer looked at him a long moment over the spectacles. And what passed over the dry face those who were present declined ever to name precisely. And Quarles said only, "We may, sir, and the deed as I shall draw it will be the best work of my life," and it was, and among its provisions at the bride's own instruction was one her grandmother would have relished above all the rest, that the fortune should stand settled in the same iron trust for the daughters of the marriage, if daughters there should be, to their separate use, generation upon generation. Mark me, Quarles, the world does not change so fast as all that, and it has not. The third visit was Lady Havermery's dinner, commanded, not offered, for the Marchioness held that a betrothal unblessed by her table was legally doubtful, and it was at that dinner over the fish that the old woman conducted, for the education of the county's dozen most useful tongues, a public catechism of the match, item by item, how the acquaintance had stood 10 years, how the flood had gone, what the school subscription owed to each party, ending, glass aloft, with a toast that was repeated in every drawing-room within 30 miles by the week's end. To Mr. Henry Ashe and the sometime Duchess of Renfield, the only couple of my long acquaintance to have conducted their entire courtship in committee, where, I may tell you, more truth is discovered about a man in one wet February than in 10 seasons of ballrooms. Ladies, mark the method. I recommend it to every girl at this table. Judge them with your boots on. And while the county laughed and toasted, far away in Vienna the other household of this story was keeping a different Lent, for the news of the betrothal travelled out on the same diplomatic post that had carried the whispers of the deed. And it reached Edmund at a card table, retailed across the bays by an attach who did not know, or knew precisely, whose face he was watching. The Duchess of Renfield, they say, to be married at midsummer to a neighbouring squire, a Mr. Ashe, a nobody, my dear sir, but they say she glows like a girl, and the Duke of Renfield played his card wrong, the first misplay of a faultless card life, and excused himself early, and stood a long time at the window of the pretty rented rooms he could no longer afford, above a street of strangers in a city that had finished with him, repeating to himself, in the tone of a man checking a sum that will not come right twice, "She will cry and beg." She was to have cried and begged, and hearing for the first time how the sentence sounded from the outside, which is to say, how it had always sounded to everyone but him. She wore the garnet ring from that evening, openly, on her right hand as betrothed women properly did in her circumstance, with the wedding set for June when the last formalities should be perfected. And the county, given its choicest morsel in a generation, chewed it with joy, and to the credit of counties, which this story has not always been able to extend, chewed it kindly, for the flood had been seen, and the school was loved, and the cold pew had been counted Sunday upon Sunday. And when the news reached Lady Havamira, she called for her writing case, and sent to Ashcombe a single line: "Sir, you have shown more sense than your whole order. Bring her to dine, and to Marianne a parcel," which being opened proved to be a fan of white lace. "With a card in the old Marchioness's savage upright hand, my dear, carry this at Easter. A woman newly happy requires something to hide her face behind, not for shame, for charity. The unhappy should not be made to see the whole of it at once." Easter fell that year in the 3rd week of April, and the Easter morning service at Renfield parish was, by long custom, the one gathering of the whole county in one nave, gentry and tenantry, the year's true assembly, and it was to that morning of all mornings that the timing of this story's last act was left, though not by Marianne, who had planned nothing but her bonnet. It was Vienna that set the clock. Because in Vienna by March the money was running visibly dry, the bills of exchange came back protested. The embassy invitations thinned as the whispers of the Candlemas deed ran along the diplomatic post, and Mrs. Sylvia Fairfax, reading the season's accounts with the cold morning clarity that was the realest thing in her, began, with perfect professional composure, to correct her position. There was a Russian count that spring, older, vastly rich, admiring, and when Edmund, rattled at last, pressed her one evening about their summer plans, Sylvia set down her cup and said, with the gentleness of a surgeon who sees no point in a slow incision, "My dear Edmund, summer plans require summer money. Go home. Go home and mend it with your Duchess. You managed her for 14 years, and you have told me all winter she is only sulking. That she will cry and beg the moment she sees you in the flesh. Go and be seen in the flesh then. I shall follow your progress with the warmest interest. From Baden." And he stood in the pretty rented room and looked at her, and had, for one unprecedented moment, the sensation of reading a ledger in which he himself was an expense that had been written off, and it frightened him as nothing in his gilded life had frightened him, and he did precisely what frightened men of his construction do. He fled toward his last certainty. He was on the packet within the week, repeating his own prophecy to himself against the wind, "She will cry and beg, she will cry and beg," and he made land, and posted north through an England turning green, and came on Easter morning with the bells already ringing up the last familiar miles to Renfield, and bid his hired chaise wait at the churchyard gate, and walked, travel-stained and rehearsing magnanimity, straight into the one gathering of the whole county in one nave. The service was ending. The doors stood open to the spring, and the congregation came out into the sunshine in its slow, bright river, and at the heart of the river, on the arm of Mr. Henry Ashe of Ashy Combe, in dove grey with Lady Havemiry's white fan, came the woman he had crossed Europe to collect, laughing quietly at something the vicar's smallest daughter was telling her, with the April light full on her, and on her lifted, ungloved right hand, where the whole county had already learned to look for it, the small dark fire of another man's ring. He stopped on the path. The river of the county flowed and slowed and stilled around the sight, because everyone recognized him at once, and everyone understood at once what was occurring, and not a soul moved to soften it. The county had chosen its side at the cold pew months ago. And the Duke of Renfield, master of appearances, made the last miscalculation of a career of them. He decided to perform. He swept off his hat, advanced, and said, warmly, carryingly, for the benefit of the crowd, Marianne, my dear, I am come home, and found his path, without drama, without a word, simply occupied by Mr. Henry Ashe, who stood aside from her elbow half a step, exactly as a man steps to let a lady view a picture, and by his very mildness handed the moment entire to her. She looked at her husband that was, in the Easter sunshine in front of the county, for a long quiet moment, and those near enough said afterward that her face held no triumph at all, which made it worse, and she said, clearly, without one grain of heat, "Good morning, Edmund. You have had my lawyer's letters, so you know there is nothing here that requires weeping, and nothing here that intends begging. You told her I would cry and beg you back. I was on the stair, Edmund. I heard every word through the door you thought was shut. So hear mine, once, in the light, since you gave me yours in the dark. Forgiveness you have, it costs me nothing from where I now stand. But forgiveness is not the same as return, and the woman you described to her that night does not exist. She never existed, and you may spend the rest of your life being sorry you invented her, or being glad the real one has done you the kindness of proving it. I truly do not mind which. And then, because it was Easter, and because she was who she was, she added, gently, the vicar keeps a good table on Easter Monday, and you look tired. Go up to the hall, Edmund, and rest. It is still your house. It was the mercy that finished it, every witness agreed. Rage he could have answered, a scene he could have survived. Scenes have two players. But to be forgiven, placed, and offered his own guest room in front of the assembled county by the wife he had priced at 6 weeks of loneliness that had no answer in his whole repertoire. And the Duke of Renfield stood alone on the church path in the spring light with his hat in his hand, watching the county bow itself past him to the Duchess as it went, and learned, in the space of 40 seconds, the complete syllabus of everything he had spent 14 years declining to know. The accounting that followed was distributed, as good accountings are, exactly according to the books. To Sylvia Fairfax, Baden, and the Russian Count, who proved on nearer acquaintance to travel with a mother, a confessor, and a family lawyer, 3 audiences she had never in her career had to play at once, and the engagement, announced in May, was retracted by August, the mother having made certain inquiries of Vienna and the world of the watering places, which has a memory like a magistrate's clerk, began to hand her gently down season by season from duke to count, from count to colonel, from colonel to a series of gentlemen described in the letters of those who saw her as very respectable, until the last certain sighting, some years on, at Baden still, presiding over a boarding-house table with great elegance and rouge, retailing to a party of new arrivals her intimate friendship with the poor dear Duchess of Renfield, whom she had known, she said, before all her good fortune, which was, in its way, perfectly true. And the company was charmed, and did not believe a word of it, which was justice of the precise and unappealable kind that world administers. To the Countess von Arnholt of Vienna, at long last, restitution, for quarrels, tidy to the end, wrote to her lawyers when the deed was done, the trust having no further use for the contract, and the Countess, now very old and very rich, and wanting nothing but the acknowledgment, received from the Duke, at his English lawyer's insistence, a full letter of apology and the £8,000 with 40 years' interest, which stripped the town-house from him and both hunters and the cellar. And it was the sale of the cellar, men said, that aged him, though those who knew better said it was the letter, because writing out, in one's own slanting fashionable hand, an itemized confession of the exact fraud on which one's whole gilded life had been erected is a penance beside which monks get off lightly. To the Duke himself, the strangest entry in the ledger, survival, and a kind of late grey, unornamented honesty that nobody who knew him young would have predicted. He kept Renfield, diminished, the trustees releasing what decency required. For Marianne would not have the tenants pay for their landlord's education, and he lived there quietly and managed it himself of necessity, and discovered in his 50s, mud on his boots, the interesting fact that his wife had been right about every drain, every lease, and every man on the place. A discovery he reported aloud at the one dinner a year Lady Havermery still commanded him to attend, where he was heard to say, without self-pity, which was the new thing in him, that he had been given the best partner in England in his youth, and had gone abroad to look for what was at his own breakfast table, and that young men who smiled at his history across the port should look at their own tables before they laughed at his. He never remarried. He was never asked to. Once a year, it became known on a day in late April, a plain card went up from Renfield to Ravensmoor, a few lines only, reporting the estate in good heart and the school subscription paid, and signed, with respect, E.W., and once a year a reply came down in a firm hand, 3 lines, no more, acknowledging the report and wishing the house well. And this correspondence, the entire commerce of 2 people who had once shared a breakfast table for 14 years, was conducted to the end of his life with perfect punctuality on both sides, and the county, which had wanted a feud and been given instead this strange spare courtesy, understood at last that it was watching not coldness, but the only honest form their history had left. An account rendered annually, examined and found at long last in order. On the June morning of the wedding at Ashcombe parish, a small wedding, wildflowers and school-children and misses, Keeley weeping into a new bonnet and Qualls giving away the bride with the deed of settlement, one might almost say, tucked metaphorically under his arm, the county received its final surprise. Delivered, of course, by Lady Havermery, who arrived late, magnificent and bursting with 40 years of other people's secrets, and who, at the breakfast, rising to her feet with her glass, addressed the groom as follows: Henry Ash, I have known your family since before you were born, and I promised your uncle at Michaelmas, when he asked me whether the woman was worthy, and I told him she was the only worthy thing in 3 counties including present company, that I would say nothing until you were safely married. and you are now safely married. So I may tell the bride what you were too proud to use in your courting, my dear. You have married the heir of Ravensmore. Your husband will be Baron Ash when God gathers his uncle, which by that gentleman's gout cannot be delayed above a year or two, and I drink to the pair of you, the Baron who courted in a brown coat, and the Duchess who chose him without knowing. It is the only love story I have ever attended where both parties concealed their rank out of decency, and it restores my faith in nothing whatever, for I knew it all along. And in the laughter, Henry, scarlet again as at the flood, leaned to his wife and murmured, "I meant to tell you on the honeymoon it seemed a poor thing to court you with, coronets having served you so ill." And Marianne, twisting the garnets on her finger, laughed the churchyard laugh, the February laugh, the one he would have gone into the water for, and said, "Henry, my love, you absolute fool, I would have had you if your uncle were a tinker. But I am glad for one thing only. My grandmother is somewhere this minute telling the whole company of heaven that her clauses held, and her girl's girl got a barony out of. The wreck after all, and it would be a hard heart that grudged the old woman her triumph." Years later, at Ashcombe, and in the fullness of time at Ravensmore, where the school she founded in the Dale is founded still, there was a long marriage of the kind that history does not record, because happiness keeps no minutes. And, in it, two particular customs that this story cannot end without setting down, because they are its whole meaning folded small. The first was the ring. She was in time Baroness Ash of Ravensmore, and there were family jewels then, cold and considerable, brought out of bank vaults for the assize balls, and she wore them as the station required, but on her right hand every day of her life, first and last, over the objections of no one because no one ever dared, she wore the small garnet ring that had been a plain man's mother's, and when her granddaughters, turning it on her finger by the fire, asked why she wore garnets when there were diamonds in the house, she told them, "Because diamonds are what a man gives to be seen giving, and garnets are what a man gives when he is giving you everything he has, and you will be offered both kinds in your time, my darlings, and the whole craft of a woman's life is telling them apart before you answer, not after." And the second custom was the drawer. In her writing desk, at Ashcombe and at Ravensmore after it, there lay always a small archive tied in faded ribbon. 5 letters in a slanting fashionable hand, Vienna to Renfield, November to March of the old bad year, and once a year, quite privately, on the anniversary of a black November night, she untied the ribbon and read them through. All 5, from the airy first to the curdled last, and tied them up again, and her husband, who knew the custom and honoured it, and asked about it only once, received the only account of it she ever gave, which was this: "I keep them, Henry, for the same reason the parish keeps the flood mark on the church wall, not out of love for the flood. So that no year of soft weather can ever persuade me it did not happen, and so that I remember every November exactly how high the water came, and exactly who I was when I stood on the stair in the dark and heard it coming, and did not cry, and did not beg, and blew out my candle and went to work. Because that is the whole of it. In the end, and if you have stayed with this story to its last turning, then take its lesson as the children of Ashcombe took their catechism, word perfect and for life. There will be a night in almost every life when you stand in the dark on some stair of your own and hear, through a door believed shut, the price that has been set on you by someone you loved. And it will be low, insultingly, laughably low, 6 weeks of loneliness, a letter wet with weeping, a certainty in a fur-lined carriage laughing at the gates, and in that moment you will own nothing in the world but the next thing you do. And the temptation, and it is enormous, and no one who has not stood on that stair has any business despising it, will be to make the prophecy true, to cry, to beg, to post the letter, because begging at least is warm, and pride is a cold house in November. Do not post the letter. Blow out the candle, sleep like a soldier, and in the morning ring for the accounts, whatever your accounts are, your money, your work, your garden, your children's school, your own good name among people who see you clearly, and begin, entry by entry, to take back the estate of yourself, because the arithmetic of hearts runs opposite to the arithmetic of rank. The person who left took only their opinion of you, and their opinion of you was the least valuable thing in the house. It was 14 years out of date, and drawn up by a man who never once read the books. She was priced at a season's sulking, and by spring she wore another man's ring. Not because she never hurried, but because the moment she stopped begging at a shut door, every open one in the county could finally be seen from where she stood, and the plainest of them had the truest light behind it. Your worth was never in being chosen, and it was never in being kept, and it was certainly never in being missed. It is in what you build in the cold months when they are certain you are weeping, and in whom you allow near you once the thaw comes. And if anyone ever again tells anyone, in a midnight hall with the trunks going out, that you will cry and beg them back, may they live exactly long enough to stand on a church path in the Easter sunshine, hat in hand, entirely forgiven and entirely finished, watching the light strike fire out of a ring they never gave, and may you, like the Duchess, be too happy that morning to look back at them twice, because the carriage is waiting, and the whole green spring is on the other side of the churchyard gate, and somewhere behind you a bell your grandmother hung is ringing. And it rings, if you have been faithful to yourself through one hard winter. It rings. It has always rung. For you.